Hi everybody, good morning. I am here as the moderator for this press conference about how the European Commission is going to spend the last 11 billion, I apologise, of the Horizon 2020 programme. Don't report 11 million. I'm going to introduce Jean-Henri Paquet, who's the Director General for Research and Innovation, and he's been in post since April last year. He's been in the Commission since 1993. I won't read his entire CV. You can look it up online. Today, he's going to announce the work programme and how the last tranche of the European Research and Innovation Funding Programme Horizon 2020 will be spent. We're going to take questions after he's said some words, and we have two press officers from the Directorate General in the audience. One is up on the stage with me, Mina, and Tonya's here in the front row. So if you have requests for interviews afterwards, please follow up with them. So I will hand over to Jean-Henri now.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. This is one of the most baroque press conferences I've ever held, I think, but that's very nice nevertheless to be here at university. What I want to do in the next few minutes is indeed to maybe just give you a snapshot of indeed the last work program under Horizon Europe, but I see that it has been distributed, so you have the news alert with you with the facts and figures of that last set of work programs, which will close the funding for that cycle for Horizon 2020. And so I also would like to say a few words on the preparations, which are very advanced for the next framework program, Horizon Europe. So I hope this is also of interest and hopefully useful for your background, maybe even in some cases maybe newsworthy. Framework programs are 7-year public funded research. This is targeted at research organizations across the European Union, but also covers partner countries and research organizations in several associated countries, particularly obviously Switzerland, where we are today, Norway, Israel, the countries in the Western Balkans, but also Georgia, Moldova, or Tunisia, for example, are countries which are associated to Horizon Europe and therefore are also part of the take-up and rollout of that public research program. The framework program is 77 billion over the period, the ongoing period. It started back in 2014 and will complete itself next year in 2020. And what is the news today is indeed the adoption by the European Commission as an institution of the work programs, making available the last tranche of the 77 million, so 11 billion euros for the year 2020. The framework program at EU level is a very big program. Notionally, it's the biggest research funding available internationally. But at the same time, it's also only a fraction of European public funding. It represents about 7 or 8% of what Europe, across its 28 member states, is investing in research with public funding. And if you add to that private funding, it represents, of course, then a smaller proportion because there is at least as much industry and private research and innovation funding in Europe as there is public funding. So the amount is big, the proportion is not, but at the same time, the framework program is also meant to, if you want, structure and leverage this broader European funding effort. And in particular, the framework program has as its core the purpose of aggregating the diversity of Europe's research across these 28 research systems, plus those of associated countries, and in many cases also then add a dimension of critical mass, where the framework program, notably with partnerships, then also allows national funding to come together and create indeed much bigger programs or projects to deliver more impact. The framework program is largely about research and applied research, and indeed today's announcement is very much around what is called societal challenges in Horizon 2020, where we will make funding available for applied research in low carbon and climate research. There will be a lot of funding around the concept of the circular economy. Obviously, there's a lot of research still ongoing on the digital innovation side and on industry. And on the side of security, there's also a lot of European-driven research with 1 billion foreseen here as well. So those figures are available in the press release, so I will not go to the details of them. So that applied research is really where indeed we can leverage, structure, and work across Europe, harnessing what member states are doing alongside that European framework program. But in addition to that, you have two very important components, which are also very well funded in 2020, which is the science component on the one hand and the more innovation component on the other hand. On the science component, we have more than 2 billion euros, 2.2 billion euros now agreed for the European Research Council. I very much hope that you all know what the European Research Council is. Can I maybe do a show of hands just to check? Who knows the European Research Council? Okay, that's not so bad. So who doesn't know the European Research Council? Okay, that's very good. So that's reassuring, because the European Research Council is indeed an institution, an agency, a program created now a bit more than 10 years ago. On the model of the National Science Foundation, as probably many of you know, very much driven by the scientific community. There's a scientific council which operates with the agency and defines the priorities and organizes the peer evaluation of the grant proposals, which are proposals meant at funding blue sky investigator-driven research. So it's grants, which are generous grants over a longer period of time, which allow principal investigators at various stages of their research to then fund a curiosity-driven project. This is perceived as really allowing the best research to compete at EU level. In fact, it represents about 1% of EU funding, and the quality of and the excellence of the project funded allows me, I think, to say that with the European Research Council, we are really having here a flagship, which says often, which I put, that it tells the world that the best science is taking place in Europe. And in fact, the European Research Council grantees are often grantees which are doing their science elsewhere than in Europe, Europeans or non-Europeans, and with the European Research Scheme, with these grants, they then come back to do their science in institutions in the European Union or the associated countries. Many ERC grantees, for example, here in Switzerland, including at the EPFL. So we will have 2.2 billion euros for this blue sky research. Maybe just one illustration of that research is the recent announcement on this first photography, so to speak, of a black hole, which was very well put out in the media across the world. This is a project which was a collaboration between European Research Council grantees and NASA, and also some other international partners, allowing the European program to go get to that cutting-edge picture and discovery. Under the program, we also fund quite a lot of mobility of researchers. That's the Marie Skłodowska-Curie scheme. Probably you are aware of it. And here again, in 2020, there will be 1 billion euro to allow young scientists to move across Europe. Now, what is also available in 2020 is a very big component on innovation, where we are piloting what will then be rolled out in the next program, which is the European Innovation Council. The European Innovation Council, if you want, is a little bit a construction which is inspired by the European Research Council, which aims at funding disruptive innovation and to help disruptive innovators to bring their products to the market and help them scale up their product and the company in Europe. The idea of the European Innovation Council is to, if you want, build on Europe's strengths, which is in life sciences, in engineering, and our analysis is that the next innovation revolution will be at the intersection of AI and digital with these deep tech sectors. And we believe that a structure like the European Innovation Council will hopefully help European innovators indeed use these structural strengths and develop and grow in Europe. Can I here just note one very important point, which is to say that Europe is not only very strong in science, but also in fact rather remarkable at creating innovation. This I know is counterintuitive, because the narrative has always been that science is European but innovation is in the rest of the world. The reality is that we are creating 10% more startups than the United States every year. 10% more last year. The challenge is often indeed that these startups struggle to grow. That's inherent to the startup construction, but they do indeed struggle to grow as fast and as high as compared to their competitors. This is particularly visible, obviously, in the digital economy, and we very much hope that with the EIC and targeting the deep tech disruptors, we will also allow these startups to grow and stay in Europe. So this is what was agreed by the European Commission, and that's the funding which will now be made available. I mean, there are obviously many aspects of it which I hope we can cover in our discussion. For example, the modalities, how we evaluate, simplification, and these kind of topics which are often also quite topical. But before, and if my moderator agrees, before opening for questions, I would also like just to say a few words on what is coming next, which is Horizon Europe. Horizon Europe is the next framework program, 21-27. Its Commission proposed a program at 100 billion euros, so a very steep increase of the funding made available. All the more steep that this is for 27 member states. It's a budget which was prepared without the United Kingdom, and that is not the case for Horizon Europe particularly. This is the entire future European budget for that period, which was, of course, prepared on the assumption that the United Kingdom would have completed the Article 50 procedure. So the increase is very, very significant. This is a proposal from the European Commission. Finance ministers need to carry it still, so there's still a little bit of groundwork to do to convince them to uphold this very ambitious and very important proposal from the budget point of view. The Horizon Europe program is to a degree in evolution. The way Pascal Lamy, who helped us assess the ongoing program and prepare the new one, put it, Horizon Europe is an evolution, not a revolution. It's an evolution because there are many elements of continuity. For example, the European Research Council is essentially rolled over from Horizon 2020 into Horizon Europe with a much increased budget, increased by more than 30% because of the quality of the impact it has. But the construction and the role of the Scientific Council and the blue sky dimension of the European Research Council is rolled over as such. What we do with Marie Skłodowska-Curie, mobility of researchers, also is largely carried over. We've tried to improve a little bit the setup to facilitate the implementation, but here also the program is largely in continuity. Where there are much greater changes is on the innovation side and on the applied research side. On the innovation side, I covered it already to an extent with the pilot, but as of 21, the European Innovation Council would be out there, up and running fully, with a budget of 1.5 to 2 billion euros every year to help scale up and also nurture disruptive innovation in Europe. And here, if you want, the European Innovation Council, beyond the instruments and the funding of innovators, is also about creating a platform for European innovation ecosystems to work better together. Because where Europe is strong on startups, because we are very strong on ecosystems. Of course, we don't have the visibility or the concentration of an ecosystem like Silicon Valley, but we have a distributed system of ecosystems across the entire European Union, in universities, in regions, across industry. And this allows indeed a lot of funding and a lot of support for startups to emerge. Now the challenge, and linked also to the scaling up, is that this is then a very fragmented picture, and the European Innovation Council will also be a place where these ecosystems can come together. And if you want, tell the innovator that yes, he is supported under one ecosystem, but really growing and scaling up can be done across the entire European Union, including with funding instruments of the EIC and a number of others available as well. If we are as successful as we were with the EIC, as I said, I hope that the EIC in 5 or 10 years will tell innovators, come to Europe to do your innovation, but at least stay in Europe to do your innovation. And I think more and more this will be the case. The biggest difference between Horizon 2020 and Horizon Europe is in fact in the applied research part of Horizon Europe, where we work on 6 main clusters: health, inclusive and creative societies, secure societies, digital industry and space, climate, energy and transport, and the last one is natural resources, agriculture, environment and food. These clusters, I mean particularly the last 3 ones, are clusters which are deeply cross-cutting, as you can hear. And the approach of Horizon Europe is to provide a framework to do much more cross-cutting research, not just across disciplines. This is done already nearly everywhere under most research and funding systems, but to deliver research results across sectors of activity, across sectors and places in society. The political backdrop to that is the notion that Europe, and obviously the world, is confronted to 3 deep transitions: the climate and ecological transition, the social transition, and the economic transition, against the backdrop, of course, of very fast-moving technologies. The ecological transition is the most urgent and most challenging one. But the social transition is about the social fabric of Europe, about the fairness or perceived fairness in society, about the future of work, obviously as well, about demographics. So that is also a deeply disruptive transition ahead of Europe. And the economic one is, of course, very much about how economic development can allow and finance and fund the social transition, and also be more mindful of planetary boundaries, which are a key dimension of the ecological and climate transition. So these are 3 very broad developments which are highly complex, with deep trade-offs between these 3 transitions, costly ones, politically, economically, financially. And the proposition is that they require technological, social innovation, and also innovation in governance to be addressed. So research and innovation should be in the program, but also more generally as a political process, be harnessed to provide packages of solutions across these 3 transitions. And this is what Horizon Europe tries to do. And we will roll out this central part of Horizon Europe across these 6 clusters to allow our researchers in universities, research organizations across industry to come forward with solutions to these 3 transitions in these various clusters. This is a deeply different approach to what we have done so far. And in particular, we have decided within the European Commission, and I will finish with that, to move away from the traditional approach where you had several parts of my institution delivering today's program. So you have 2 programs in transport, for example. You have 2 programs in energy, 2 in agriculture, several in ICT, several in industry, distributed across the organization. Tomorrow, Horizon Europe, to allow this cross-cutting work across these areas and these areas of activity and the economy, is now not anymore distributed across the Commission. There is no one in the Commission which owns a part of the budget. This is now owned collectively, if you want. And therefore, we have in the Commission co-created the program and you had departments in health, in environment, in climate, in transport, in energy coming together to discuss the portfolio of projects, to discuss the foresight, what is awaiting us, what is awaiting the world, and also discussing how public policies will need to be delivering in 2030. And from that discussion, we then collectively identified the strategic priorities of Horizon Europe. So that is a very deeply disruptive process in the sense that, to an extent, we are putting into question the relationship which existed between small teams in the Commission, specific sectors outside, and stakeholders. And we are now asking for a much broader set of players to shape the program. And that is why, after having co-created the main priorities of Horizon Europe in the European Commission, we will now enter into a phase of co-design, where we will ask all stakeholders to help us get the program right. And this is a process which kicks off now. There's a public consultation ongoing, which then continues with a major event in Brussels in September, the Research and Innovation Days, where during 3 days, European administrations will speak with stakeholders to get these priorities right. Ultimately, this will be about delivering in 5 main missions under Horizon Europe, one on climate adaptation, one on clean cities, one on clean oceans, one on restoring soil health, and one on cancer. And these 5 mission areas, we will have a board of personalities which will help us define what exactly Europe wants to achieve in these 5 areas. And from that very concrete and tangible objective, then work first on the research agenda and then on public policies delivering the outcome in society. So what I'm telling you is that Horizon Europe is, of course, a very powerful research program, but that the program is not particularly about creating science and research, but about creating science and research for solutions to the transitions and therefore embedding it into public policies across the broadest political spectrum. If we manage that, we will have a very impactful program and hopefully also a little bit of a better world in 10 years. Thank you.
Thank you. So now's your chance to ask questions. I was just trying to think if I've ever been in a more Baroque press conference myself, and I'm not sure. Have we got questions from the audience? I have one here in the middle. There is a mic coming. Can you say who you are and where you're reporting for as well, please?
Yeah, sure. I'm Laura Howes. I'm reporting from Chemistry and Engineering News. And we spoke just now about building the programme for Horizon Europe. But taking it back to this final tranche of Horizon 2020, can we talk a little bit about how the political priorities were identified and how that process worked?
Time for that.
Well, the priorities were identified 3 years ago on the basis of the existing regulation, which sets out Horizon 2020. And 3 years ago, we had a less intense but a similar process of strategic planning where we worked to identify a limited number of focus areas on which to then concentrate the funding, and these are the ones which I mentioned, climate, digital, circular economy in particular. And then, of course, there is a process where on a yearly basis we also engage with stakeholders, largely through expert groups, which then help us and guide us to identify more specific research topics. For example, this year we have substantial funding on plastics, substantial funding on batteries, for example, where the experts and colleagues across the European Commission working on the broader supply chains on the battery and the electric mobility discussion are now identifying additional research needs, and this is then reflected back into the program. If you compare this Horizon 2020 process with the Horizon Europe one, which is now in preparation, I mean, there are obvious similarities, trying to have the longer-term perspective and trying to move out of only the technology-related setups. But the main difference is that Horizon 2020 is already largely predicated by the legal text and then largely organized across departments in the European Commission. So energy, transport, etc. In Horizon Europe, we will be much more cross-cutting, and we will also have more flexibility with the legal text, which is more an enabling framework than a highly prescriptive super work program, if you want. Which is why we go through the motions of really working now for at least 4 or 5 months across Europe, and probably with stakeholder input beyond Europe, to get the priorities for the first 3 years of Horizon Europe right in this top-down, bottom-up interaction.
We have a question here, and then if you can bring the mic into the middle.
Good morning. Giacomo Mazzone from the European Broadcasting Union. A question with multiple phases. The first part of the question is, we have seen one of the industry in Europe that has suffered more from disruptive, from digitalization, has been the media industry. And the investment that has been made through European Union and through other actors in this sector has been very small until now. And it's, for me, as a European, surprising and deceiving that the Fund for Innovation on the Printed Media is financed by Google, that is like asked to the wolves to take care of the sheep. So what is in this plan specifically for that? Because I don't know where you locate in the 6 clusters that you mentioned before. And second part of that is, you mentioned that there will be a fund for mobility of researchers, but we are in a Congress of journalists. There is any part of it that is devoted to the mobility of journalists? Because I think that is very, very important that the journalists know across Europe and even in the rest of the world what is happening.
Well, no. It's for researchers only. That is the focus of the program. And so the mobility, the Marie Skłodowska-Curie, is a program which has a long history. It is not created now under Horizon Europe. It has been rolled out now for more than a decade, as far as I remember, much more than a decade. And we don't. We need to focus on that. So there's no proposal to extend it to the media as well. Even if, of course, I do see, and this is present in the program, I do see that we need to communicate with the public much more than we have been able to do that. And when I say we, this is clearly not the European Commission particularly. This is research organizations, universities, national administrations. Because the science discussion in Europe is one, of course, which is diverse. But being myself, having been raised in France, I can see my society, if you want, the one I know best, being challenged by scientific progress and challenging scientific progress in the last 20 or 30 years to an extent which is limiting our capacity to do research, but also to use research results on the ground. Let me give you one example, which is on gene editing, which is, of course, a difficult subject, where we have obviously very robust and ambitious ethical guidelines, in particular when this concerns life sciences. But where we also are with the legislation on GMO, which is an important piece of legislation, and where the precautionary principle enshrined in the treaty, of course, needs to be fully upheld. But we have had rather remarkable developments on plant gene editing across Europe in the last 10 years, and more recently with CRISPR-Cas. And we have now had a number of concerns in civil society, which then materialized with a number of lawsuits. And we now have a ruling from the European Court, which is essentially equating plant gene editing with GMOs, which will have an obvious impact on the capacity to deliver new agricultural techniques through that science channel. And that is something which is, of course, a limitation on scientific research and its deployment, but much more importantly, it is a real limitation in connecting agriculture with climate. Both in terms of mitigation, but also obviously for the future in terms of adaptation. So it's really extremely important that we have a broad conversation in Europe with our citizens to bring them back into science, and then of course they will have their very legitimate views. But I think that many of the views expressed around science in Europe, and the vaccine debate is another very important one, obviously, is one where I think our scientists and our research organizations and then public institutions in their remit also should indeed ensure that the debate is taking place. And media in that context obviously has an important role to play. But Horizon Europe is not about that in terms of funding mobility of journalists. On media per se, which is now a broader question, this also is not the purpose of Horizon Europe. Horizon Europe is a research program. This is a different discussion, probably across other policy areas in the Commission and other programs such as media or Digital Europe or Erasmus. But if there is a media research part to be done, this can be funded under Horizon Europe, and has been done in the past. And we have a component in Horizon Europe on European democracy, rules of law, values, where obviously media freedom and media plurality are areas which are certainly eligible for research to be carried out. But beyond that, the research program is, I don't think, equipped to really help on a broader basis.
Thank you. We've got a question here, and there was one just down the row. If we can take them both. And I'm aware we've got 5 more minutes, and I know people have got lunches to get to, so Inga.
Okay, yes. So I'm Inga Vespa, I'm reporting for Research Europe. I have a question related to the consultation on Horizon Europe. So I've been covering the framework program since the good old days of Framework 7, and it's always been a very industry-heavy program. So, and we know that the European Commission is very heavily lobbied by industry, so I have a question that's relating to how you're going to weigh responses. So when these responses come in, how will you weigh responses you get from big companies and from industry representatives versus those that you get from academia and maybe even from the general population whose tax money is paying for all of this? Thank you.
I mean, maybe just I think I should note that we are interacting with absolutely everyone. Huh? Not industry particularly. I think I'm personally much more under intense interaction and input, let's call it lobby, from universities than from industry. They are there absolutely all the time, and rightly so. And the same goes for many research organizations. So I think this perception that industry is overly present, I think, is due to the fact that, yes, under the research program traditionally, and this will to a large extent also be a part of the preparations of Horizon Europe, we have these very important industrial partnerships, which of course give maximum visibility to the hydrogen industry, to the electronics industry, to the aviation or rail industry. But across the program, and I think precisely the way we are preparing Horizon Europe and the way we now want to co-design Horizon Europe in the next phase is precisely set up in such a way to ensure that absolutely everyone is part of it, and this was not the case before. I think the effort we are now doing at reaching out is unprecedented. As I said, largely for Horizon 2020, today's program, we are often operating through expert groups. There are no expert groups for Horizon Europe, at least not for now, because I very strongly believe that there should not be an interface between European administrations and the stakeholders and the citizens. And so you will see that the consultation has 2 phases. Firstly, of course, we make the various documents available in writing. So the very first document was made available yesterday, Orientations for the Strategic Planning, which is the analysis of European administrations on the main priorities to deliver Horizon Europe, and in particular across these 6 main clusters. That paper is now open for consultation throughout the summer. I think it's 12 weeks, starting from yesterday. And we will have an extraordinarily wide number of replies, I hope, and across all areas. And so there is no disproportionate or statistical weight assigned to any group or another. We will really look at the content to the maximum extent possible, because on the one hand we have a number of questions, which then allows us to do some statistical analysis, but we also have many open questions, which I think will allow all interested to really give us guidance. At the same time, obviously, a consultation is not about just capturing absolutely everything. There will need to be choices. And so the idea is that in this public consultation, we will also have these 3 days meeting in Brussels, the Research and Innovation Days, where registration is open. We are a bit overwhelmed with responses. Everybody wants to be there, because during these 3 days, the European administrations will be available to discuss any part of the program. And when I say European administrations, I mean member states and Commission together will be available to discuss with industry, universities, civil society, research organizations, and other interested groups. We will discuss the papers. We will also discuss the future missions, because at the Research and Innovation Days, the mission boards, which will have been established by then, will be present. And we will also start a first discussion on the future partnerships, in particular the joint undertakings, because the first phases of the impact assessment to prepare these more specific proposals will also be available. So this is going to be very broad and a direct conversation between you and Commission. And I hope that with that we will have a better and even hopefully a much better outcome. Now, the choices made in the end will be made on the basis of a text from the Commission, discussed then also with member states and ultimately adopted by the Commission. But for the program to be successful and to impact deeply into outcomes in society, it needs to reflect if you want, the wisdom, common sense and priorities of Europe. And we will ensure that this is brought to the furthest level possible. But I'll be happy to take stock on the process at the end of the year when it runs out. Sorry to be a bit long.
Thank you. I can't see anyone. Have you a quick question here? And then we'll wrap it up.
Hi, this is Matteo Rini from American Physical Society. You correctly described ERC as one of the most successful, or at least perceived the most successful ingredients of the program, but it's a small fraction. In preparing the next program, is there a sense that this part that's more, that gives more freedom to scientists in terms of topics should be expanded compared to, telling them to develop a more efficient solar cell? Or
Yeah, it has been expanded. It's the biggest increase, I think, across, as far as the Commission proposal is concerned. It's the biggest component, and I think the biggest increase, where you can compare, because things have, the structure shifted a bit between Horizon 2020 and Horizon Europe. It still is only in our proposal, I think, 16.6 billion euros over the next period. So clearly, if you look at the success rates, and the quality of the non-funded applications, we could increase it massively, and it would still be money extremely well spent, that's for sure. But there are obviously broader constraints to be taken into account. The overall budget has limits, because the overall EU budget, I don't know if you realize that, but the European Union budget is 1% of Europe's GDP, 1%. And we propose in the next period to move it to 1.11%, I think. So it's a very, very small budget, and within that budget we do regional policy, we do agriculture, we do research, we do space, we do many, many, many things. And in that context we were able to significantly increase the overall budget, and in that context also significantly increase the European Research Council. But I don't think that the story ends there, frankly, because the European Research Council has emulated very similar constructions in member states. So you have ERC-type institution now in several member states at EU level. So obviously it's not the same scope in terms of competition, but it still is funding programs at national level which have this quality of a scientific council really overseeing them. And of course, a lot of basic science or bottom-up science is also carried out at national level. It's not all done in the program. So yes, we have prioritized it, we have increased it, and I hope this will allow the ERC to continue to shine as a lighthouse in the next phase.
Okay, thank you. If you've got any further questions or if you want to request an interview afterwards, Mina is here and Tonya's in the front row, the lady in white waving now. So I think I'll just say thanks ever so much, Jean-Eric Paquet, and thanks to you for coming.